dentistry. People you don't see in the mainstream media, people who are not, there on every front page or every top 50, but who go very quietly about their daily work, grinding away, pushing away. But I get to see and listen to these people because I interact with many of them on an individual level. So it has been a really, really amazing and cool month. We started with Dr. Mahmoud Mauji, who gave us a really awesome journey and how we became a self development motivational coach. We then moved on to hearing from Dr. Riz Syed, who is an implant surgeon. And I think Riz basically got some of the amazing comments. People were humbled by what he said. Some people saying that they were going through the same thing and they were basically going to quit dentistry. Now, when you get that sort of thing where somebody is going to quit dentistry and they hear Riz speak and they say, I feel so good, empowered, I will carry on through the difficulties or the hardships, it's really inspiring. And then they had yours truly talking about my journey in perio, my journey in dentistry. I took it all the way back to my journey in Kenya as well. And from there, we basically spoke about how I started dentinal tubules and the challenges, the fun, everything else that I have faced. From there, last week, we had two very inspiring, what I'd like to say, young practice owners, or about to be. Mihir Shah and Nikhil Sethi gave us their insight into buying a practice as a young practice owner and developing it. And what they ended up doing and showing us was that anybody and everybody can achieve whatever they wish to be. So it's really positive. And at Tubules, that's what we do. You might be listening to this and going, I am tired of dentistry. The stresses of COVID have worn me down. Some of you might be thinking, need to think of another career, need to think of plan B, all of this. And for us, more than CPD, it's always about helping you develop your energy, whether it's in dentistry, anywhere else. And for that, we need to always make sure that we are working together and we are inspiring you. And I'll tell you a bit about that before I welcome today's guests, because this culminates this month's Journeys theme into a very, very nice way. And that's what we do. But Tubules, as a website, as an organization, as an entity, as a project, is nothing more than a growth engine. It is your growth engine because that's what we like to do. And so I give you three questions. Question one: are you inspired by dentistry? Or at the moment, are you feeling lost, demotivated, stressed, unhappy, tired, whatever it is? And the truth is, if dentistry truly inspires you, or if you are looking for inspiration in dentistry, you've just landed on the right page. Because dentinal tubules is more than education, more than CPD, it's putting that fire in your belly. And if you're looking for truly genuine, empowering growth, development, improvement in your career as a dental professional, wherever you are, whichever way you take your growth into, you've landed at the right space because we like to give you that. This is the right place at dentinaltubules.com. And surely, if you want to maximize your potential to thrive rather than just survive, then you've found the right organization at dentaltubules.com. Because every week, every Monday at 7:30, we give you Tubules Live. We then have other things which I'll talk about, but we do this on Monday evening because we want you to start your week on a positive, energized, brilliant note. Because if your week starts well, your week goes well, and you are tubulized. And that's why we say we give you more than just education. We are an organization of tubulites who like to inspire, who like everyone to grow and thrive together with each other. So come in and explore your growth engine because we will rev you up and get your foot on the pedal. And when or what other time do you need that than now? You really need that. And growth is about improvement, about developing and getting better every single day. It's about making sure that today you're better than yesterday. Tomorrow you will be better than today. And there are 5 items needed for growth. As the work we've done is keep showing this, you need to know where you're growing into. some sort of target, some sort of goal, some sort of direction. You need to have the knowledge, learning and investing the time, the commitment, and the money and the resources in developing your knowledge and your skills is so important. And part of growth means you need the right environment, the right work conditions, the right support, the right place where you can get feedback, you can accept failure. And more than anything else, you need a brilliant community, because when you have a good community that supports you, that's positive, that's encouraging, helps you grow. And at Tubules, we have that. The IPDP takes 180 seconds to prepare, ticks the GDC and CQC boxes, but it's much, much more detailed than that. We're not doing an isolated farm PDP. We're doing a Tubules Tigers PDP that gives you that direction, that gives you and measures how you go. Our knowledge, we have nearly 2,000 lectures and videos and everything online now, with over 50,000 minutes of learning. It'll take you a lifetime if you get through them. But that's the amount of investment we've made to make sure that any lecture you enjoy is available on Tubules. We offer hands-on courses, we partner with other people, we have our congress to help you develop your skills. As the environment grows, we have our practice membership and our practice owners club, and we ingrain good leadership, good team building, and creation of good environments with everybody. And as study clubs and groups go, we have over 45,000 members worldwide using the Entitled Tubules, with nearly 50 study groups, I think over 50 study groups in the UK itself. Obviously, they can't meet right now with our current environment with a pesky virus called COVID-19 creating a bit of havoc, but the study groups still meet and still connect virtually. So it's so important to have these 5 elements of growth, and no other organization gives you that, because our passion to help you get through these difficult times and always remain inspired and positive in dentistry. And we enable your growth in 3 areas, not just professional and vocational, not just CPD, but financial and personal. Because if you grow everywhere as all rounded individuals, chances are you will get much better outcomes. And you know what we want to do is more than just CPD. Others do CPD as continuing professional development. For us, CPD is the complete person development, developing you as a person and a professional. That's what we aim to do. That's why we say our motto is inspire, grow, and thrive together. Because at Tubules, we like to do that. And on that note, we've created this theme and this topics of Tubules Live. Each month has a theme. August theme was journeys. September's theme is all about conversations, communication, talking at the reception, in chaos, in converting or talking to your patients about money, all sorts of difficult conversations we need to have in practice. And each month, October, marketing, November, orthodontics, December, the recommended topics, we are going to carry on giving you talks and Tubules Live related to themes that cover all these areas over the coming academic year, if you'd like me to say that. So keep tuning in every Monday evening, 7:30. It's free for everybody to watch live. So go and tell your friends, go and tell your colleagues, go and tell people you don't like, because this will help everybody. It's about us doing this together. That's what we want, really. And that's why today's journey ends up in such a great place, because your journey may end up in buying or selling a practice. This continues so well from last week. And Andy Acton got in touch with us about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we've managed to convert logistics, everything in a few weeks' time to bring today's session. I hope you enjoyed that. I will introduce him in a minute. CPD is available for premium and practice members. If you're a base member, you can enjoy this, absorb the knowledge, because it's going to empower you. But you need to be a premium member if you want a certificate, because we can't give everything for free, unfortunately. As a business, we have to operate and stay viable to support the profession. What you'll see is a page like this. This is not the title. Today's title is different. You'll see a video. Just below the video, you'll see this comment box. If you can hear me, just type yes. Below the comment box, you'll see the CPD questions appear. Not yet, but at the end of tonight's live stream. You'll just refresh the page. Answer the questions. When you've answered the questions, you type yes. You type in your reflections. Remember, the powers that be like us reflecting on everything. Type in and tick the goals. I'm hoping you've created your IPDP. You type your high level outcome, and then give us the feedback. If you don't do all of this, we can't give you CPD. You have to ensure all of this is filled in. And when you've actually finished answering all of these questions here, you will get this to say the CPD is added to your account. Go to your IPDP, click on IPDP link CPD certificates, scroll down, and you can print your CPD certificates. They'll be available straight away. For base members, yes, you can't get the CPD. So if you scroll down, you will see something that asks you to upgrade. We know times are difficult with COVID, so we've also introduced a quarterly membership now for dentists. And for nurses, hygienists, therapists, you can apply and get a special rate as well. So we are catering for the whole dental profession. And even in these difficult times, we're trying to do whatever we can to keep you going. And you can do a trial before we charge you. So 14 days, enjoy it if you've never done the free trial before. We will do all we can to give you as much as we can, because together we would like to make sure that Tubules works here to help you inspire, grow, and thrive. And with that, and my long ramble, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Andy Acton, who is from Frank Taylor Associates. Hi, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Drew. Good evening to you. An excellent introduction as ever. It's such a positively challenging group you've created. It really is. You know, you really get people to ask a lot of questions of themselves and then provide all the answers. It's fabulous.
Thank you so much. Well, we try. You know, positivity, I believe, is a good place to be. The glass can be half full or half empty, if you can see mine. And
Yes.
it's always try to make it half full. And thank you so much for sparing your evening on a bank holiday Monday, because I know you have amazingly important and other things to do as well. But it's so good to have you on board. And everybody can hear us very well. We have such a great group of people who've signed in today. So you know, it's brilliant how this topic came about with our discussions and how it fits into everything that's happened over the last few weeks. Not just COVID in the last few months, but what I mean is Tubules Live and the journeys that everyone's spoken about.
Mm. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I thought it'd be useful as well just to talk, because ultimately I think a lot of people have ambitions about buying a practice, but some will and some won't. But I just thought it'd be interesting to talk through the history of where we've been and how we've got to where we are, because I think even if you continue your life as an associate, which is still an amazing career in its own right, I think just to understand what's happened in terms of the values and the history of the ownership and the change of hands of dental practices is no bad thing. You know, I always believe that you should always understand the other person's point of view. So if you're an associate working in a practice and perhaps you understand the challenges that a principal has, that's a useful thing to have. And equally, if you own a practice and you understand the challenges that people have that are buying them, that would be good. So there's a bit of a history lesson in there. And then there's some tips for buyers and tips for sellers, and then we can take any questions that come.
and talking of history, let's start from your journey. How did you end up in practice brokerage, practice elements? Because you've been with Frank Taylor and Associates for many years.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those things. I never woke up one day and thought it'd be a good idea. I was actually working in the city, and Frank Taylor and Associates was established back in 1988. And it used to refer its business into the bank that I worked for to fund the acquisition of dental practices. And a guy I worked with, Chris Evans, who was the person that I bought the business with and is still in business with me, we suggested to the bank that the bank should acquire this business, because then they would have the exclusive rights to providing the funding for the acquisition of practices. And the bank said that they thought it was a bit niche. And we were like, but that's the point. That's the whole point. Capture a market. The bank didn't want to take the opportunity, and amazingly, they were happy for Chris and I to go ahead and acquire the business and continue to work in the city, which was amazing. It was amazing. So we had this really good idea that what was going to happen is we were going to buy the business, we were going to continue working in the city, it was going to pay us a really big dividend, and we'd live happily ever after. That worked for about 6 weeks. And then we realized that the people that we bought the business from were no longer running the business, and we needed to run it. And we had to change our strategy really quickly. So for anyone who thinks that everything's easy and it's an overnight success, it's not. You know, most people who own a business have had challenges, problems, sleepless nights, cold sweats. You know, you get the whole gambit. It all goes in together. And The challenge that we had is that when we bought the business, it was Frank Taylor and Associates, and all it did was value and sold dental practices, which was great, but it was a one-legged stool. So if anything happened to that market, it fell over. There was no recovery. So whilst Frank Taylor and Associates is still absolutely a valuation and sales business, from a wider strategy point of view, we needed to do more. So because of my background and Chris's background in banking, it seemed to make logical sense that we could set up a brokerage and arrange finance. So we did that, and we set up FGA Finance, and that worked really well. And then if you get a bank loan, typically you're going to need some life cover, and you may need some critical illness and some other forms of protection. So we thought, well, actually we need a wealth business, because then we can do the insurance and protection. So out of that came FGA Wealth. And all of the things that we've added on and extensions are they the sorts of business services that dentists need, and can we provide it? So we did finance and we did wealth. We then acquired a recruitment business, because if you own a practice, you may need associates, hygienists. So we have a recruitment business. And then a few years ago, we wanted to improve the timings on getting deals going through. So we set up FGA Law. And most recently, we set up FGA Media, which is a video marketing business. So I've kind of ended up with a group of companies. I've now got 8 companies, and there's FGA Mortgages, and they all deliver business services into dentists. But it's been quite natural and organic in how it's happened. It has to meet the test of, does it, assess, protect, to enhance the value of a dental practice or the person that owns it or works in it. And if it meets that test, it's something we're interested in. And that's how the group has kind of naturally grown and evolved. And over that time, I've got, I'm so fortunate. There's an amazing team of people that work with me, an amazing group of business partners. It's worked really well. It's been good fun.
I quite enjoy listening to that always as part of a journey, because you've evolved, and I love watching evolution. And with that, you've gained grams and grains of experience, knowledge, because I suppose you didn't know a lot of dental terms and dental things, and you've picked them up as time has gone on. Speaking to dentists, we speak a different language sometimes.
Absolutely, and you learn quickly, and that's the best way. I think when you get into business in the early days, I think you need a healthy dose of naivety. I think the danger is if you don't have that, you will crush your own dreams and your own ideas, because you'll see fault and problems and issues and too many challenges. Whereas if you've got a dose of naivety and you just go for it, you just deal with them as you go, because you have to. And so I think naivety in business is very underrated.
I think so. I agree. And in fact, people who are listening today, that you will have questions. And if you feel happy to ask those questions, please start to type them in the box. What do you want to gain from today's session? What sort of questions you want answering? And Andy's actually been very kind. He's spared a day, the 9th of September, when he'll give half an hour sessions one-to-one for people who want to individually discuss with him on a private level. I'll put that link up a bit later, and you can book it directly with him. But what we want to do now is get to the meat of it, really. And we will start with the presentation and what Andy's going to cover. I'm happy for you to share the screen if you're able to, Andy, to get the ball rolling as well.
Yeah, sure.
If you start typing your questions anytime through the live stream, feel free to type the questions below, and I will happily relay them to Andy. We will try and answer them as we go along. But what we want to do is help you get the maximum out of this evening's amazing session. Thank you, everyone, for sparing your time on a bank holiday weekend, listening to Andy and I speak. Over to you, Andy.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Drew. So you can probably see on your screen, hopefully, we're going to have a chat about the practice sales market. That's going to be linked together with what's actually driving goodwill. And there's obviously 2 sides to it. There's the buying side and the selling side. And then we're going to dig into some tips for buyers and the tips for sellers. Whether you're a buyer or a seller, it doesn't really matter. I think it's really interesting to see the other person's point of view, because that then gives you an idea in terms of the context and the landscape and the shape of what you're looking at. So to start, let's go back to 2005. So anybody listening who is over 40 would probably remember items of service. So this was back in the dental days, where basically you got paid for what you did, which I know now there's a contract that's a limited amount of money. That might seem quite bizarre for some of the younger dentists. But in essence, for each amount of dental you did, you got paid, whereas the new contract came in and things changed. So back in 2005, Associate pay rates were typically at 50%. Some associates did incredibly well. The associates who were able to deliver an awful lot of work found themselves in an environment where they were earning a significant amount of money. So from a Frank Taylor Associates point of view, this is the number of people that we had registered with us who were looking to buy a dental practice at that time back in 2005. So there were 1,459 people who were interested in buying a dental practice. That seems like an extraordinary number to start with. And bearing in mind, we're talking about 15 years ago. And to give it further context, this business started back in 1988. And back in 1988, there wasn't an open market for the purchase and sale of dental practices. It didn't exist. It was done on handshakes and in pubs. And if there'd been coffee shops back then, it probably would have taken place in coffee shops. That was how business took place. So the creation of an open market was something that was quite new back then. So we had 1,459 people. The very next year, this is when what we call the new NHS contract came in 2006. And that had a dramatic effect, because what happened there is that capped the amount that a practice was going to earn by way of money from the NHS. Private, it still had the potential to grow that as much as it wanted. But bearing in mind that the majority of practices had an NHS contract, they were limited by the amount that they could earn now. So if you were a principal and you own a dental practice, the way that you could impact your profitability, because now your income is fixed, the way you impact your profitability is you reduce your costs. And one of the significant variable costs in a dental practice is the associates. So suddenly associates felt really vulnerable, because what a principal could do is a principal may have been, say, working 2.5 or 3 days a week. They could increase their days to 4.5 days a week, have a reduced reliance on associates, and improve their profitability. So what that meant was associates felt vulnerable, and so the number of associates looking to buy a dental practice shot up, and there was a significant increase to just over 2,800 people in 2006. And that was a real sea change, where lots of associates wanted to capture their security. They wanted a more secure future. They felt that as an associate, they were vulnerable. They could have their days reduced. They could potentially have their pay rate reduced. So that was a real turning point back in 2006. And then towards the end of 2008, the global recession hit. I think Lehman Brothers in about October 2008. That was what seems to stick in my mind as being the start of the recession. And then we had the subprime mortgage issue in America. And it was deep and it was dark. But again, what that did in terms of people wanting to buy a practice was a similar effect, because people found that associates felt vulnerable again. And you know, this kind of story as we work through it is about the vulnerability of associates and how they wanted to protect their future. So again, when the recession hit, lots of associates felt that their livelihoods were at risk, because a principal may want to deliver more of that dentistry to preserve their profit. So more people registered again. And then in 2011-ish, things calmed down. Dentistry was in good health. The NHS was still in demand. Private fees were coming back quite nicely, and the economy was stabilised. And during that period, there was a bit of growth. There's always people adding to the pot in terms of wanting to acquire a practice. And if you can see that from a 1,459-ish number from 2005 to 2011, we're now sitting at just shy of 4,500 dentists looking to buy, which is an extraordinary amount of people. And then we had a period of stability, 2011, running through the 13, 14, 15, 16, and 18. It was all quite stable. And then obviously earlier on this year, COVID turned up. And the theme here is when there tends to be a crisis or recession or an issue that challenges dentistry, what tends to happen is associates feel vulnerable. They feel vulnerable and they want to get their security. They want to lock in for their future in the long term. So what happened here is that when COVID came along, there was another surge of people wanting to buy practices, because for that very reason, you know, as an associate through the COVID pandemic, if you were earning more than £50,000 a year, there was no support from the government. You couldn't work because dental practices were closed. They weren't allowed to reopen until the 8th of June, and many didn't open on the 8th of June. There was a staged recovery. When they did open, many of them were only doing emergency treatments. So from a personal earning point of view for associates, it was really challenging. And lots of associates were needing to dig into their savings to get through that period, and there was no government support. When those sorts of things happen, quite often people reflect and say, well, how do I protect myself? If something like this ever happens again, and I don't want to find myself in that situation, what are my choices? Sadly, some people have made a decision that they're actually leaving the profession. They just feel that it's not for them. Because in times like this, I think there's a lot of deep and really thoughtful reflection in terms of what people want. And as we've seen with the numbers increasing, lots of dentists have said, well, if something like this does happen again, the way that I protect myself is I have security of an asset. So principals, when they were able to reopen their practice, they did have an asset to go back to. And don't get me wrong, it's not easy. Owning a business and going through this is not easy. However, as a business owner, I did have, and principals do have, dental practices return to. So there is an underlying asset that you can return to. As an associate, you feel vulnerable and exposed, and we're back to that security point of view, and that's why that number's grown to the number that we are today. So that was a very quick step through a 15-year history to give some context as to how that number got to over 5,000 dentists wanting to buy a dental practice to where we are now.
I mean, there's a few things I look in there as well. It looks like there were certain, especially the global recession and now COVID-19, when it seemed like you had the sort of largest percentage jump of dentists saying, I'm going to look to buy a practice. So that was very interesting to note. The contracts had less of an impact as much as the economy did. I don't know if that had any angle or any influence that caused that. Any thoughts on that?
I think it is. I think it's quite well known that we only tend to buy things for two reasons. It's greed or fear. The purchase for fear is a lot stronger than for greed. And as we can see here, I'm not saying that all these people will buy a practice, but it was the fear that drove those numbers up. The recession was the fear of, I'm not going to earn money, I'm not going to be able to provide to my family. What does my future financial situation look like? Obviously, everybody got hit in the recession, but people were taking a longer term future view and saying, well, how do I not let this happen to me again? Lots of those people that got in at that recession stage are now practice owners. And like I say, we're going to come on to the challenges that it's brought for practice owners. But I think that was a big fear. And I think for COVID now, I think the two things are linked. I think both of them are fear. Like I say, I think greed purchases rank at a lower level to fear. And I think both of those were really scary moments for people.
It's almost a sense of security, but and what that creates, Andy, I guess, is a surge. Standard economics demand supply curve creates difference, because I suppose the number of practices who are in the market or which are in the market, and I suppose you'll go onto that at some level to talk about sellers. So I'm not going to ask about the numbers, but there is a supply demand curve here that may be skewed or may be impacted.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always a certain number of practices that come to the market just by virtue of life stages. Lots of people sell their practices because they're retiring, they're relocating. Sadly, poor health in dentistry is too high. I think, neck and back issues are rife. I think it's getting better. I think ergonomics in terms of some of the stools and the chairs that are available are a lot better than they were before. I don't think people are necessarily spending the hours chair side that perhaps they would have 15, 20 years ago. We've got lots of dentists who have joined us from overseas and perhaps want to retire back to their homeland. So that brings another dimension. We are starting to see a new breed of more business-minded entrepreneurial dentists who are seeing an opportunity to capitalize on the growth of the value of their business and are waiting for the right time to sell. But there aren't many of them. Most of the practices that get sold are because people have got to a certain life stage, and that's what sparks them onto selling. But I'll come on a bit later in terms of the timings around that. because actually where it tends to go wrong in most cases is people ring up and they want to sell their practice and they've already booked the cruise. You know, they've already decided when they're going to be putting the keys through the letterbox and they want to go, and that's not a good plan. You know, it's a much better plan to speak to somebody a couple of years before, really get organized, really structure it, really plan it in, because that's how you're going to get the best value. But I'll come on to that a bit later.
I'll look forward to that, but let's carry on with the numbers and the history again as you're carrying on.
So that was the buyer's side. So that was kind of the context in terms of if you were looking to buy a practice, what happened in those 15 years. So to take us forward to what happened to practice values, we've got the axis here shows value and time, and then there's two. There's private goodwill values and NHS goodwill values, and I'm just going to pick out certain things that happened through the last 15 years, and some of them are the same for buyers, but just we'll have a look at the impact it has on the values. So back in 2005, values were at a certain level. NHS goodwill values have always pegged at a higher level than private values, and we can talk at other times about the whys and wherefores as to whether that's right or whether that's fair. In essence, it's because NHS money is government backed, so it's seen as more secure. There's a counter argument that says if you have an NHS contract, in essence, you only have one paymaster, which is the government. So if something changes to that structure, it's going to have a direct impact on your business. If you have a private practice, and say you have a couple of thousand patients, if you lose 2 or 3 patients, the impact on your practice isn't that great. However, there's still a leaning towards the comfort that goes with NHS income. So I've already mentioned about the new NHS contract coming in 2006, and what was really interesting is when that came in, that's what happened to goodwill values, because at that time, in essence, it meant that you couldn't any longer just open an NHS practice, start delivering NHS dentistry and be paid for it, because there are only so many contracts to go around. And there were certain areas where there was some new NHS money, but they were few and far between. So in essence, if you didn't have a contract, the ability to set up a squat practice and rely on NHS income had pretty much disappeared, other than some rural areas. So you can see that the NHS values went up more sharply than the private ones. The private ones still continued, they started to increase, and that was good. And that ran along through until 2008, when the recession that we've already talked about hit. And you can see what happened to values here, in that NHS was seen as a safe haven. So again, even through a recession, people thought, well, if I want to buy a dental practice, and lots of people still saw acquiring a dental practice as being a really good thing for the reasons that I've mentioned before, because it provided income, it provided with security. So people continued to want to buy dental practices, and many people bought lots of dental practices through the recession because it was seen as that NHS safe haven. But what they did do is, through that period, when the recession hit, goodwill values for private practices did take a nosedive. The ones that were least affected were those that had what we refer to as a good, strong local franchise. So these are practices that have been open probably for 10, 12, 15 years or more. They had a really reliable, mature patient base. They were delivering lots of routine dentistry, and those patients continued to go to the practice. So their fee income held up quite well. Back at this time, there were a lot of people who were fairly new into cosmetic and aesthetic dentistry. So they were doing lots of work that was quite high value. They hadn't built up a mature patient base, and they got hit quite hard. You know, people weren't having the whitening and back then the veneers and some of the implants and the work that's very common these days. And so the value of those practices got hit quite hard, and it got hit for 2 reasons. One, there wasn't the market and the demand for such practices, but also those practices, the underlying financial performance fell away as well. So when you apply a percentage or a multiple to those practices, their numbers had dropped, so their value came down. But there was a period of time when the NHS was still seen as that safe haven. And then an interesting thing happened. We had a bit of a plateau, because when the new NHS contract came in 2006, there was a 5-year period where that money was ring-fenced purely for NHS dentistry. And 2011-ish, when that came to an end, there was a slight pause in the market where people thought, well, if that money is no longer protected for the NHS and there's going to be a stretch on NHS funding across all NHS services, is there the possibility that there's going to be the reduction in commitment to NHS dentistry? Is there going to be a contraction of contracts? Is the terms and conditions under which that money is made available going to be altered? Are people going to be looking to get more by way of UDAs, or they're going to have to offer additional services, perhaps a smoking cessation clinic as part of their contractual requirements? And there was slight nervousness about what that contract would look like. It didn't actually manifest itself in any significant changes, and everything continued, but there was a period where things flattened down. But if you look at the private goodwill value, which is the bottom line, it was starting to recover now, because we were a year or so out of the recession. People were starting to feel more comfortable in their jobs. Confidence was coming back, and confidence is one of those crazy things. It's incredibly easy for it to be lost, but for it to come back, it takes time. It comes back slowly, and you may have seen this personally. You may have suffered a setback of some sort. It knocks your confidence, and it's amazing how you could have done so well for so long, and one small thing happened, and it gives you a jolt, and it takes you quite a while to recover. And economies work like that as well. You know, the economy took a significant hit in recession towards the end of 2008, and it's a slow, gradual recovery as people and the economy's confidence returned. And then we see that private dentistry now is really on the up. It's coming back. And if we look where we are now, private dentistry is higher than it ever has been. You know, it had been rising up to 2008, and then it took a dip, but now it's at its high point. And people are seeing private dentistry as being a good place to invest, and also long-term future. People back in 2010 through 2012 were saying, well, if I'm going to be buying a dental practice and I'm buying it for the long term, and typically when people buy dental practices, they own it for between about 10 to 12 years, something in that order, some longer, some shorter, but that's about the average lifetime that somebody would own a practice for. And I've got a theory that I think is about fatigue. Most dental practices are owned by sole principals, and I think you can run for so long as a sole principal, but I think there gets a time when you just get worn out. And for me, it feels it's around about the 10 to 12 year mark where people just say, I still really enjoy the dentistry, but managing people, looking at spreadsheets, needing to be responsible for the sales and the marketing and the quality control and dealing with the Care Quality Commission and the overall burden and responsibility of owning a business, particularly when you're a sole principal. I'm so fortunate. I've got 8 business partners across 7 different businesses that would work with me and help me, because I know I'm not good enough to do it on my own. But as a sole principal, you're responsible for everything. And so that fatigue starts to kick in. And I think people looked and thought, well, if I owned a private practice, perhaps it gives me more freedom in terms of how I run that business if I'm going to be running that business for the next 10, 12, 15 years. So then we move forward, and the next thing is the banks, and the banks are critical in terms of driving values, because if the banks aren't lending and providing money into this market, the whole thing just grinds to a halt. They are a really, really important part of the equation. You need buyers, you need sellers, and you need money. And where that money comes from, in most cases, is from banks. Very often people have very healthy contributions by way of deposit. There can be family money to help transactions work, but 99% of people are going to need support from a bank. We are incredibly fortunate with the number of banks that see dentistry as a green light sector. So it's a really exciting time to be acquiring a practice, because there's so many banks and new banks who are supporting the sector. And for where we are at the moment, the reason they like the sector, and they also liked it as we came out of the recession, is banks have to lend money to somebody. So when you have to lend money to somebody, you look for the lowest risk market you can go. So when you lend money, it's as safe and as secure as possible. Healthcare has always been a low risk market. Within healthcare, dentistry is low risk within healthcare. And by virtue of that, it's a great place to lend money, because typically dental practices don't go wrong. The simple financial mechanics of a dental practice work really well. You have income, you have your core costs, and they normally produce a net profit on the accounts of somewhere between 20 and 22%, and on an adjusted basis, they can get upwards of 30%. So the simple mechanics of a dental practice work really well, and that's why there is widespread support from the banks. So values kept moving, and then COVID turned up. If I could tell you what the next 5 years look like from here, I'd probably be a very, very wise man. Unfortunately, we don't know where it's going. What I do know at the moment is the demand for dental practices, as you saw on the previous set of numbers, is at an all-time high. Simple economics, buyers and sellers, where you've got lots of people wanting to buy, so the demand's high, and the supply that is less than the demand. That tends to mean that values go up. So as you can see on the chart, values are increasing, and that's kind of where we are at the moment. The banks are still seeing it as a sector that they're supporting. So we've got a perfect triangle in that we've got a good number of buyers, we've got a healthy number of sellers, because there are people who literally just put their hands up and said, I'm done. You know, this COVID thing, I don't want to have to go into the whole new world of you know, fallow time, increased PPE, and you know, all that it's going to bring in terms of the future. And it's going to settle down. But people are like, I just don't know if I want this next round of change. Because values are up, they can perhaps sell now and take out a bit more equity value than they thought they were, which means they might be able to stop working a year or two early. And we've got the banks lending money. So at the moment, the conditions are really good. But that kind of line chart was designed to show the other side to buyers, to give kind of, you know, both sides of the same coin, to give some context and some history as to why values are as they are.
In terms of the valuation, as you've shown over the last almost decade and a half, it's something very interesting to note that the private practice trajectory is almost rising higher over the last, I don't know, sort of 9 to 10 years compared to the NHS practices. So that's one thing which is very interesting to note. Add to that, the one factor that hasn't come in is the sort of growing role of patient plans. They seem to be becoming more robust within practices, and this transition from primarily or large patient base of NHS care to private care that many practices try and work upon in order to get the independence from the NHS bureaucracy. That's a very complex equation to work with, but has that had any bearing for you? Because I guess the demand for practices of a certain type and the valuation, and has that impacted this and all those factors that come in there?
It has, yeah. I mean, the plan-based income is wrapped up in the private line, just because it was more straightforward. I think you could put in another line for plan-based, and I think that plan-based income going forward is going to be something that lots, if not most, practices should absolutely factor into their financial modelling, because the practices that did have some plan-based income, be it, you know, DPAS, STEM plan, practice plan, you know, all the host of other great plans that are out there. What it meant through the COVID lockdown was there was some cash flow in that business that kept coming through. Yeah. And it's kind of like having almost the perks and the benefit of an NHS contract, but not the restriction of working in an NHS environment. Because yes, you don't have this in private practices. Quite often you can have a great month and then you have a poor month and a great month and a poor month, and it can feel like you're riding a roller coaster. Whereas if you have the plan-based income, very often you may be able to get that patient base to a level where your core costs are covered, and then the private is the bit on top. So sure, you're still going to have it you know, looking like a roller coaster, but it's not going to be the very steep, you know, peaks and troughs. It's going to be flattened out. Going back to the bank widespread support as well, the banks like it as too, for the same reason that recurring and reliable ongoing income works really nicely. And I think it's also easier for practices to know if they've lost a patient. You know, very often we visit practices and we say, well, how many new patients have you got? Or how many new patients are you recruiting? They say, oh, I'm getting 20 new patients a week. And it's like, well, brilliant. So, you know, by virtue of you owning your practice for 20 years, you should have 25, 30,000 patients, and you don't, because what they don't factor in and they don't necessarily know is how many patients they're losing, because those patients just don't come back. Whereas if they're on a plan base, yes, you actually know if you've lost them, because that payment doesn't come in. And one, I think, is a really good trigger to know that you've lost a patient. So there's some questions to be asked around, well, what do we need to do to make sure we don't lose patients? But also, I think that if you're continually receiving a payment from a patient, I think that gives a higher level of obligation and responsibility to make sure you're continuing to deliver services for those patients. It's a bit like gym membership, isn't it? You know, gyms of the old style used to just take your membership and keep quiet, whereas now they're encouraging you to go and see the personal trainer. They're telling you about classes because they know if they don't do that and they don't get you into their facility, the next thing that's going to happen is you are going to cancel your membership. So I think plans are great. And like I say, the banks like them as well because it does give that reliable income. So I think if we kind of looked at where plans fit on this line chart, I think the plans would sit above the private line. So where you've got that green line, it would probably sit somewhere between the green and the blue line. And if we roll out a few years from now, it wouldn't surprise me if it starts getting closer to the NHS line.
Well, this is the interesting area because that's a sweet spot for the buyers and the sellers at both levels to work with. And this historical aspect is really interesting. The valuation keeps going up, and the number of buyers keep going up. And the number of sellers, they've remained fairly similar. Is there a geographical element to that as well that you've noticed?
There is. I mean, very recently, the geographical spread has changed quite a bit. So pre-COVID, the geography, the two things that tended to drive buyers were, was it near a dental school and is there a football team in the city? Which I know sounds bizarre, but if you think of where football teams are, they tend to be in reasonable sized towns and cities. So if it's somewhere you've heard of,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to perform better than the smaller, more rural areas. Also, if you think about the motorway network in the UK, anywhere that's easily accessible from a motorway tends to value better as well. So if people are familiar with the UK and they think about the M11 runs off the M25 out into East Anglia, but it stops about Cambridge. So what that means is that Suffolk and Norfolk are quite difficult areas to get to because you're on A roads. So you're typically traveling at something like, as an average, 30 miles an hour. So you can't cover large areas. Therefore, if you're looking to buy a dental practice, the radius that you can look at, the circumference of your audience in terms of desirable practices, it's not huge. Whereas if you were living in somewhere like Milton Keynes, which is very close to the M1, you could get 50 miles north and south. So your area to look at is huge. What has happened since people have come back to work post lockdown, what we are seeing is an increased desire for practices in the regions. And you may have seen in the news that they were saying about the hospitality trade. They were saying that pubs and restaurants in city centres aren't performing as well as pubs and restaurants in local areas and in the regions. And I do wonder whether there's going to be a shift and people are going to say, well, actually staying local, staying within my local community might be something that I want to do. And we have seen an increased uptake of practices in more rural locations down in the southwest, in the northeast, in mid Wales. And historically, they wouldn't have been areas that you would have typically said were that popular. I mean, sure, the big cities, the large conurbations, yes, London, the northwest, the Midlands hub, they're always going to be the most popular just by virtue of the proportion of population. There's more people in those areas than anywhere else, but we have seen an increase in some of the more rural regions, which I think is really encouraging. I think that's really good for dentistry across the country.
I think that's really nice to see as a spread. And it almost ventures into the kind of things you're talking about, the tips for the buyers and the sellers, where to locate and go. And I suppose that's the
Yes,
next part of your talk.
yes, let's jump on.
So yeah.
So a nice tee up from Drew there. So we're going to start with these are the tips for the buyer. So these are the 9 things that you really need to think about if you're looking to buy a dental practice. And I think there's actually a TV program called Location, 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 and it's for a good reason. It is so important. When you're looking to buy a dental practice, you cannot change the location. So this should be non-negotiable. If it's not in the right location, you should either discount it or you have to be prepared to move into that location. with practices, you can change an awful lot about them, but the one thing you can't change is the location. And the reason that's important is there's going to be a daily grind. You're going to be traveling to and fro that practice 3, 4, 5, possibly 6 times in a week. If that journey isn't agreeable to you and palatable, it's going to get boring and unpleasant so quickly. I had a guy who I advised many, many years ago, and he lived in Ealing, and he had a friend who was selling a dental practice in Milton Keynes. And he said to me that he travelled to the practice and it only took him 40 minutes. He thought that was just about doable, and he was thinking about buying it. So I said to him, I said, when did you go and see the practice? He said it was on Sunday. I said, okay. I said, could you do me a favour? I said, could you leave at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning and go to the practice? I said, and get back to me. And he rang me back and said, oh, what a nightmare. He said, it took me 2.5 hours. And I said, that's really important as a lesson. It's so critical that you get comfortable with that daily journey, because it's something you're going to be doing a lot. So the location and the daily grind fit together. You know, you can't change the location. So if you want somewhere that's near a train station because you think that's going to be a really important part of your marketing plan, you need somewhere that's near it. If it's not near it and that's part of what you want, you have to discount it. Once you've worked out the location, you have to make sure that it's doable in terms of the journey that you're going to be making. The next thing you need to do is you need to work out your budget. There's nothing worse than oohing and ahhing and cooing over certain practices if they're not within your reach. And it's a relatively straightforward and easy thing to do. What you can do is you can speak to a commercial finance broker, and they'll do this for free. Within the group, there's Frank Taylor's FTA Finance, and what they'll do is they'll provide you with a pre-assessment certificate. And in essence, what that means is they look at your own personal situation, that is your asset and liabilities, your income and expenditure, what your own personal grossing ability is and the sort of dentistry you've been doing, and give you a guide in terms of how much they believe you could borrow to go and buy a practice based on your personal situation. As a thumbnail guess for you, just to give you an idea, you're going to probably need a deposit of about 20% of the overall purchase price. So you'll know what you have by way of savings or have by way of access to funds, family funds possibly. So whatever you have, that's your 20% deposit, and a bank would typically lend you the rest to get you up to 100%. And establishing your budget is important, because then when you start looking at practices, you really want to be looking at practices that fall within your budget. Okay, if they're slightly outside and you think you might be able to negotiate the price, that's okay, but you'd be wasting your time. So say your budget's £800,000. With the best will in the world, there's no point in looking at 1.2, 1.5 billion pound practices, because they're not going to be within your reach. You might as well focus your attention and effort and energy on a practice that could actually be a reality. And that budget then relates to the size matters. So let's say that your budget is £800,000. So depending on where it is in the country, that may be a practice that has a turnover of say £500,000, just as a guide. So if a practice has a turnover of £500,000, that's likely to be a 2 surgery, possibly 3 surgery practice. So you can see how these things start to join up. But once you establish your budget, that then gives you an idea in terms of the size of practice you're looking for. But remember that the more surgeries there are, the more there is of everything. So more surgeries means more management of people, it means a larger team, it means more clinicians, it possibly means a hygienist, it means a bigger premises, so it means more repairs and renewals with that premises. So bear in mind that the larger the practice, you end up with more of everything. But if you get your budget established, that should link through to the size of practice that works for you. And then you need to think about experience and ambition. You should really be looking to buy a practice based on your current experience. So if you've only ever worked in an NHS practice and you're used to the UDA structure and the requirements to treat patients in that environment, moving immediately with no experience of a high-end private practice may not be a great idea. What you might need to do is get some experience in that world, build that experience up as an associate, and then look to acquire practice in that environment. So that's what I mean about experience. But also ambition. You may have ideas and plans of what you want that practice to be in the future. So you may have NHS experience and there's an NHS contract, but there's perhaps 3 surgeries, but only 2 are being utilised. So what you may have the ambition is to deliver more private dentistry or more aesthetic treatments or whatever it might be, or specialise in a particular area, perio-endo, whatever it might be. So think about your future ambitions and see whether this practice is going to meet those for you. But also remember, it's a bit like buying a house. It's where you're going to buy your forever home as your first time purchase. So this may be a stepping stone to where you ultimately end up. So don't think that this has to be the one and only, because it may be a stone that gets you to where ultimately you're going to get to in 3, 5, 7, 10 years time. Something else as a buyer is tap into the specialist advice out there. This is a well-trodden path. This is a path that's been trodden by thousands of people before you, and there's specialist advisors out there that know what they're doing. So you've got finance brokers, you've got sales agents, you've got accountants, you've got solicitors, you've got people who've been down this road before. Tap into them. Sure, they're going to charge you for their services. However, it should be more than paid back in their experience and the advice that they can give you to make sure that you don't trip yourself up on the way, because you're going to be making a significant investment. And whilst the bank may be supporting you, and okay, the bank may put in perhaps £600,000 and you're putting in £200,000, believe me, the bank can afford to lose £600,000. You may not be able to afford to lose your deposit. So really tap into that specialist advice and make sure that it's working for you as best as possible. So that's a lot of the pre-planning that you need to do to get an idea in terms of what sort of practice you're after. And then you get down to the nitty-gritty of viewing a practice. This is when you actually go in and you spend some time in the practice and meeting the principal. What you're going here for is you're going there to build rapport with the person who owns a practice. You're trying to get into the culture of that practice. Talk to the principal, find out what sort of practice it is, what the team are like, what the patients like, what sort of services they deliver. Really get into the nuts and bolts and feel whether it's the sort of practice that you'd feel comfortable being part of. Why are they selling the practice? Is it a well-led practice? Is it somewhere that when you move in, you're going to be able to continue the good work that's already been done? Because one of the things when you buy a practice you shouldn't do is change too much in the early days. The biggest change a business can go through is a change of ownership. So what you don't want to do is then get into the practice and start changing a pile of other stuff, because that's going to unnerve the patients and the team. And actually what you want is stability to make sure that you protect your investment. So that viewing is really important. So you viewed a practice, you've seen it, you like it, you've looked at the numbers, you know what your budget is. Perhaps you've spoken to a financial advisor or someone that's got some business experience. And now it's the point that you need to step off the edge. This is taking action. This is making an offer on the practice. This is a bold step that needs to be taken. You don't want to be offering on every practice, but when you find the right one, go for it. Because as you've seen from the numbers of what I've talked about earlier, there's no shortage of buyers out there, and there aren't enough practices coming to the market for the number of buyers. So if you've done your research, you know what you want, you view it, you like it, be quick, get in there and make an offer. And really make it yours, really go all out, really try and impress the person who's selling and build a relationship, if it's through an agent or with the seller, and make sure they know that you really do want this practice. And then the last thing you need to do is your offer's been accepted, which is a great milestone to get to, is you need to keep momentum. Getting through a transaction, you've got to get the deal done. So when you engage with your solicitor, whatever they ask for, turn it around quickly. Keep the pressure on the seller, keep the deal moving. A deal should take no more than a few months, but quite often what happens is it's as much the buyer's fault as the seller's fault, and the seller's fault and the buyer's fault. But these deals tend to take longer than they need to. But getting momentum into the transaction really does mean that you've got the very best chance of getting it through to completion, because ultimately it's exciting to put in an offer, but you want to get in there, you want to get the keys, you want to move in and take over and start delivering your plan and turning it into your dream and turning your future into a reality. So getting that momentum through the deal is really, really important.
What this momentum is so important, but you might have seen that sometimes buyers go through this entire journey of looking at practices, location, size, planning. They put in an offer, how many of these kind of almost fall off the cliff once the offer is in, because of some reason or another? And what reasons may cause it not to happen that you should advise buyers to be aware of?
Very, very few of them fall through. In the experience of Frank Taylor Associates, it's 2 or 3% a year, and the reason that they tend to fall out. In the last year or two, we've had one or two where it was either the buyer or the seller suffered ill health, very unfortunately. But most commonly, it's third-party landlords. They tend to be the people that scupper it, just because when you're buying a practice, you need to buy it as a freehold or a leasehold. So the person who's selling it owns a property, and they will either sell it with the property or they will create the lease. But if you're
Mhm.
buying a practice that's a leasehold, it probably means the person that owns a practice doesn't own the property and they have a lease themselves. So the person who owns the property, that's the third party landlord. And it's a third party landlord that needs to transfer the lease, say from your name, Drew, into my name. And very often it's that third party landlord who is incredibly slow. They don't care. For them, all that's happening is one tenant is changing for another. They're not invested in the deal and they're not bothered. And quite often it's those landlords that just stifle the deal. It loses momentum. And then quite often, typically what happens is the buyer loses interest, because this could have run on for 6, 7, 8 months. But they are few and far between. As an organisation, we work very hard to make sure that if there are any showstoppers or red flags, we identify them as early as possible. And we're invested in it as well to make sure that momentum's maintained. Because you're right, without momentum, it's horrible. Because if you don't have momentum, so for example, going back to the funding, the bank approve a loan, and that loan is only approved for a period of time. If you don't get through to the stage where you draw that loan down within that approval period, you have to go back to the bank and get it reapproved. If you get it reapproved, they may want the practice to be revalued. So as a buyer, you're now in for additional cost of having it revalued. You've also got your CQC application ticking in the background as well. It just turns into a nightmare. If you can keep things ticking along, it's so much better for everybody. But yeah, it's third party landlords. Occasionally it's finance is the showstopper, but that really should be known quite early on. That should be known in about the first 4 to 6 weeks. If as a buyer you're not going to get finance, you should know that within the first 4 to 6 weeks. And if that did happen to you, the best thing you can do is be really upfront, be really honest, and just bow out graciously. It's no reflection on you, because ultimately somebody has to lend the money. And from a broker's point of view, that's not a black mark against your name. All it means is that you may need to look for a different sort of practice in the future.
And some buyers have asked this through this period, because they'd put in an offer, things were rolling, and then pesky virus COVID-19 struck. And a question they keep asking is, do we need to go back and revalue these practices? Because they're saying, well, patient numbers may be affected. We don't know what the future is going to be. Do we need to? Because valuations based on historical numbers, I suppose, and things are changing going forward. What sort of thought processes have you had in your experience with this?
Yeah. So within there, what we're doing is it's such an extraordinary situation. Obviously, what we can't do, and it would be completely inappropriate, would be to look at the income in a practice over the last 6 months and base a valuation on that, because practices were shut, they weren't able to work and operate. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, the NHS contract at the moment is continuing to come through and continue to be paid. How that's going to change in the future, we don't know, but we've never known the answer to that, because there's been pilots and mini pilots and proto pilots, and they've got more pilots than the RAF at the moment going on with the NHS. We don't know what that's going to look like in the future. And on the private side of things, what we're saying is, from practices reopening, it's reasonable for allow them to be open for a 3-month period, and then assess where they're at in terms of income after a 3-month period, and effectively say, well, are they back more or less to where they were pre-COVID? If they were back to where they were more or less pre-COVID, then in my world, the pre-COVID valuation would seem to be a reasonable position to be. If they're below, then I think I would want to ask some questions and understand why it's below, what's happened. Is it a case of fallow time has been taken very literally and a practice has been working very slowly and carefully, which means they haven't been able to recover? Have they genuinely, seen a reduction in patient numbers? In my experience, that doesn't appear to be the case for any practices. I think practices are incredibly busy. But equally, what we wouldn't do is, if a practice over a 3-month period did incredibly high numbers, we'd want to see whether that was pent up demand through lockdown that gave a real spike in those numbers, and is that number sustainable? Because equally, we want to be involved in fair transactions. The people who are buying practices today are going to be selling them in 10 years' time. And we certainly don't want to be in a situation where people are overpaying for practices on false numbers. So that 3-month period is quite important, but it's also looking at it and saying, well, if it looks like it is kind of pre-COVID, that works, and we'll go to the pre-COVID valuation. If it's below, we want to understand why. And equally, if it's above, has something materially changed, which means they are just operating at a higher level, or was that just some pent-up demand that created a spike, in which case that needs to be factored in as well?
That's very useful to know, because that adds another question here, which I think was from one of the sellers. But talking about these valuations, and the question that someone's asking is, the valuation that is currently there across the country is quite high. They're saying it's high. Even bank managers are not able to identify how the figures are reached. Is this just a sort of market demand place? Are agents using pre-COVID levels? Are they adjusting? What's creating this?
So yeah, it really is simple economics of supply and demand. Pre-COVID values were very high. Post-COVID, we've seen there's been an increase in the number of buyers. What that hasn't meant is, it hasn't necessarily meant there's been a shift upwards in values, but what it does mean is that the values that were being applied pre-COVID, more and more sellers are getting their asking price, or possibly a little bit above their asking price. Values are high, but actually they're still affordable. And I think there is a point at which they don't become affordable, because in essence, when you pay for a practice, you have an income, you have your cost base in the practice, you probably have a bank loan that needs to be paid, and you have your own personal drawings from that business, and that all has to be available from the net profit in that business. So there is a point at which actually that kind of simple equation doesn't work, but it can get skewed as well, because we do have situations where people very often turn up with a 30 or 40% cash contribution, which means their requirement for a bank loan is compressed, which then means the burden on the business to repay a bank loan is reduced, which means that there is more cash in the business to pay the owner. So, like I say, there's no kind of one size fits all. But at the moment, I agree with the question asked. Values are high. However, they are still affordable, and dentists are still prepared to pay those high values. And I think it goes back to my very first section about, through COVID, what we've seen is a lot of fear from associates, and them feeling a lack of security because they didn't have an asset to go back to. And I think a lot of people are taking a view that, yes, I know I'm paying a high price for a practice, but what it does do is it gives me an asset, and it gives me future security.
I think that makes sense completely, of working through that. There are a few other sellers' questions, but this is perhaps the good time to move to the next bit, which I suppose is the 9 tips for the sellers to think about as well. And then there are quite a few questions coming in, but I think if we round that off, the rest of the questions will fit in very nicely as well.
Yeah,
So
sure.
are you happy to carry that on?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's move on to the seller side of things. So now this is the consideration for the seller, and it's been quite useful, hopefully, for the sellers to get insights from buyers in terms of where they're looking at, and now it's the seller's turn to find out what's important to them, but also from the buyer's point of view, understanding what's in a seller's mind and what's driving them. I think knowing your why is critical. What's your motivation for selling? Why is it you're selling? Selling a dental practice takes some time, and there's going to be some bumps in the road on the way. And when you hit a bump, sometimes you're going to need to go back and remind yourself and focus on why it is you're selling your dental practice. And it may be quite obvious to you when it's retirement. I've got to an age where I'm going to retire. There may be a different reason, but just understanding within your own mind why it is you're selling is quite important. The second thing is timing. I mentioned to Drew earlier about we get a lot of people who come to us have already booked the cruise and are looking to leave and be out of the practice in 6 to 9 months. From my point of view, that's a real nuisance, because I can't provide any guidance or help or tips on things to do to make the practice more attractive or anything to impact on the value of that business. It really is value it and sell it. In a perfect world, you really should be thinking about selling your practice probably 2 years before you actually sell. You don't have to. We can cope with people who want to have a valuation and sell straight away. But if you're in a point where you're just thinking about it, it's not a bad thing to start talking to somebody and just trying to get an idea as to what's involved. If you've got a couple of years and you're fortunate to have that timing on your side, you can think about are there ways of improving the financial performance in the practice? Could there be some minor decoration works that could be incorporated into, you know, the weeks and the months that you have on your site, just to improve the desirability of that practice, of your practice? It's not essential, but in a perfect world, if you had a couple of years, that means you're going to optimize the value for your practice. The next is to think about what sort of buyer is out there for your practice. And here they fall into 4 main categories. If you have a business partner, whether it's an expense share partner or a shareholder limited company, you more than likely have a legal obligation to offer your practice to your partner. So it's worth just checking your shareholders agreement or your partnership agreement to see if that's in there, because you may well need to do that as a legal obligation. The second type would be an associate who works in your practice. You may have an associate who's put their hand up previously and said, if ever you come to sell your practice, I'd be really interested. Associates can make great purchasers of your practice because they know your team, so they're a known quantity, they've been known to the patient, so it can work to be quite a smooth transition. An issue with associates that can come up, though, is where you deal only with the associate, there's no competition. So where there's no competition and the associate's the only person involved in the process, the deals can drag. I've seen cases where principals have been selling to associates and it's taken 9, 12, 15, 18 months because nobody really got on and got it moving. So if you are talking to an associate, it's important to put some timings around it and make things happen. You could also speak to an agent who could act on your behalf and manage that process for you, just to make sure that things keep happening and moving along. The third category would be an independent dentist. So going back to the very beginning, that 5,400 people looking, that's this category. So these are the people who just register with an agent, they work somewhere else, you more than likely don't know them, but they're eager to buy a dental practice. And that is the majority of the market. That is the most people out there who are looking to acquire a practice. And then the last group are the corporates. And the corporates come in various shapes and sizes. We've got at the very top end, there's groups who own several hundred practices, and down at the bottom end, I consider the smallest end of corporate being sort of 10 or 12 practices and upwards to a few hundred. Corporates are an active part of the market. People seem to think that corporates are buying up all the practices and taking over dentistry. That's not my experience. We overwhelmingly sell most of our practices to independent dentists, but we do work with the corporates and make sure that they're factored into the process. A corporate can work really well if you want to continue working on post-sale, because you would need to work on in that practice for probably a 3 to 5 year period, because there would be some deferred funds. They would probably hold somewhere between 25 and 35% of the purchase price, and you would be paid that as a deferred consideration over that 3 to 5 year period. So there's various types of buyers out there, and it really comes down to your situation in terms of which one is the most appropriate. Something else that you need to do, and you can do this today, perhaps not tonight because it's already 20 to 9, but you get the gist. You can really start getting into that, preparing the documentation now. Even if you're looking to sell in a year, 18 months, 2 years time, you can start assembling your paperwork. I believe that it's actually got easier as time's gone on, because a lot of this needs to be prepared for CQC purposes. but start knowing where your employment contracts are, your lease documentation, your full NHS contract, your CQCs up to date, your finance agreements, all your service contracts for your compressor or suction motors, your telephone contract. If you've got an alarm, has it been serviced? When was it last serviced? All this paperwork that sits with the practice. Start preparing that documentation so that you know where it is, because I'm coming on to two dreaded words later called due diligence, and that's when you're going to need them. The next thing to consider is whether you need a practice sales agent or not. You can sell your dental practice yourself. You don't need to. But what a practice sales agent will do for you is they'll find you the buyer. They'll pre-qualify the buyer for finance to make sure that they're suitable in terms of being able to buy your practice. They'll negotiate the sale, and then you've already heard that word momentum. The agent will make sure that there's momentum in the deal and get it through to the finish line for you. So it's worth considering and at least finding out what an agent can do for you before you make a decision. You then need to get your practice valued, and it's really critical that this is independent. So you need an independent valuation so that you know that valuation has been prepared for your basis and for you alone. So you don't want it prepared by somebody who's approached you to buy your practice, because guess what? They might be biased. They might not be coming up with the best value for you. So it's got to be independent and it's got to be for you. There's a variety of people out there. One of them clearly is Frank Taylor and Associates, but I would urge you to get a valuation and make sure it's independent and without bias, so you know truly what your practice is worth. And then that will give you the benchmark in terms of the expectation. And then you can start doing some future planning in terms of what that outcome might look like and the net proceeds that you'd receive from the sale. So then finding potential buyers. Like I say, you can do this yourself. You can place an advert on a dental forum, in a magazine, in one of the journals. You can find buyers yourself. My only word of caution here is there's going to be a degree of confidentiality, and you just need to be careful what information you supply to potential buyers, because at this stage, they're only prospects, and you may not necessarily know their true motivation for trying to find out details about your practice. So just be aware on the confidentiality side of things. And again, going back to the sales agent side of things, have a chat to a sales agent, see what they can do for you. What you should be doing really is you should be trying to find buyers from the widest source possible. And the phrase I use for it is the open market. You really should be going to the open market, because that's where you're going to find the broadest range of buyers. And by going to the broadest range of buyers, hopefully that's going to get the best value for your practice possible. And ultimately, you may have owned this practice for a few years. It may be your life's work. You deserve to get the very best value for your practice possible. And typically, you need to go to the widest audience possible in terms of finding your buyer. I said those two dreaded words earlier, due diligence. So if you did your preparing the documentation well, the due diligence is going to be a breeze. And due diligence, from the seller's point of view, is your solicitor is going to say, can you supply me with this information? And it's going to be quite a weighty tome, and there's going to be a lot of information you're going to have to provide. And there's no shortcut. There's no sidestepping it. You're going to have to go through and answer the questions and provide the information. This element probably has the greatest bearing on when your deal completes over and above any other element. Because as a seller, the responsibility on you is to provide the paperwork for due diligence purposes. At the very best end, I've seen due diligence done within 2 to 3 weeks. In the worst scenario, I've seen it taken more than 6 months. My word of caution to you as a seller is if it takes you 6 months, you could lose your buyer. Seriously, you could lose your buyer if it takes you that long. So preparing your documentation and getting yourself ready so that when the moment comes you need to produce your due diligence, you can do it quickly. That keeps momentum in the deal, because the better the momentum, the more everybody stays engaged, the more excited everybody is. People are touching the file on a regular basis, so everybody knows what's going on. It's just good all round. But honestly, doing your due diligence is time well spent. And then the last point is getting through to completion. You need to get momentum in the deal, but then when you get to completion, what you can do is have a really nice moment when you reflect, and you can go back to that know your why, and you can remind yourself why it is that you sold your practice and move on to the next chapter of your life, knowing that you got through the whole process and you sold your practice. So that was the end of my talk. There's my details. If you want to email me or connect with me on any of those, you'd be very welcome to. I tend to be quite active on social media, so if you've got any questions, I'll come back to you, and I post from time to time as well. I mentioned at the beginning the group, and that's who we are and what we do. It fits quite nicely what Drew was saying at the beginning. You know, my ethos and my approach and the team that I work with, we're happy to give you literally as much information as we can. You know, the more information we can give you, the more we can share, the more we can inform and educate you, the better informed you're able to make a good decision. And that's kind of the bedrock as to what we're about. If ultimately you then come and use it for a service, that's fabulous. But even if we've done a job and we've informed and educated, we've had a good day.
I think this is very, very useful with lots of different discussion points. As say, Andy has freed up the 9th of September. If anybody wants a one-to-one sort of private consultation discussion with Andy, I will post that link in the chat box down now. Bring in your questions. Let's answer some of them as well, if that's okay, Andy, for the last sort of 12 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, please, if that's great. If anybody does want to see any slide, please let us know, and we're happy to put that back up as well. I think let me start with the questions a bit backwards, but Ismail Quasi asked a very interesting question, and it's related to lease. When you buy a practice, how long a lease is a good expectation for a purchase, or short enough to cause concern? What's a good long length
Right.
lease?
So the importance of the term of the lease primarily is around funding. So a bank will only lend typically, let's take out Howard Walden because that's kind of an anomaly, and I'll come back to that in a second. But typically a bank will only lend money over the period which you have the right to be there. So what that means in English is if there was a 15-year lease and there were 11 years remaining on the lease, the bank would typically lend you the money over 11 years. So if you've got a 15-year lease and you've only got 7 years remaining, you can only borrow the money over 7 years. The ability to repay the bank loan over 7 years is probably going to be quite hard. That's probably going to be quite challenging. So what we typically say, if you own a practice and you've got probably less than 9-10 years on your lease, we would typically suggest that you have a conversation with your landlord and see if you can extend your lease back to 15 years. Because from a seller's point of view, the longer the lease, the better, because that means that's going to support your value. And from a buyer's point of view, the longer the lease, the longer you're going to be able to borrow your bank loan over. And anything round about 6, 7, 8 years starts to become challenging in terms of the repayment capability on the bank loan. I mentioned Howard Walden. So for those that aren't familiar, Howard Walden Estates own significant parts of the W1G part of London. So Harley Street, Wimpole Street, all that district. And they typically only issue 3 or 5 year leases. And so the banks tend to understand that, and because they continue to be renewed, they will typically lend over 12 or 15 years. Another point which is important, just finally on leases, which is relevant for buyers and sellers, is it's worth checking whether the lease is under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. And the reason that's important is the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 gives the automatic right of renewal to the lease. So you can be kicked out of the premises for certain reasons, and typically the two main ones are if the landlord wants to use the premises for their own purposes, or if they want to redevelop the land. Those are the two main reasons that you can be kicked out of the property. But without that, you do get the right of automatic renewal. And so from a buyer's point of view, it's quite comforting to know that if you're going to be buying a practice and you want to stay there for 12, 15, 20 years, you're likely to get your lease renewed.
I was very silent there. It's just useful to know. Good question, Ismail. And Ismail's got another question. How do you check and do the due diligence to avoid getting a practice or a company with hidden debt that could be passed on the share sale purchase?
So that's the responsibility of your solicitor. So when you acquire a practice that operates a limited company structure, it can happen one of two ways. So you can either acquire the assets out of the limited company, which means you literally just buy the dental practice, but you don't own the shares in the limited company. That's retained by the principal of the practice. But typically what you would do is you would acquire the shares in the limited company, and your solicitor, they have a duty of care and a responsibility to make sure that the company you're acquiring is clean. So any debt that's in that limited company needs to be disclosed, and typically that's going to get discharged. So you would take on that limited company clean and there wouldn't be any debt in there. If there is, you would need to be made aware of that, and that will be reflected in the deal that's you're taking over.
Erica asks a question, but I'll probably put it in a bit of a wider context. And this is about how long can you expect that momentum and dealing between a buyer and seller to go on? If it's over a year and it's being extended well beyond a year, when does a seller or buyer decide this is actually time to walk away? What has your advice been in those sort of situations, Andy?
Um, Typically, a deal takes about 6 months.
Okay.
We see some that breeze through in 3 or 4 months. I wish there were more of them, but they are quite unusual. 6 months is quite typical. Quite a few end up at sort of 7 or 8 months. If a deal is a year in and it's still not completed, something needs to be looked at. There's something fundamentally has gone wrong. So whether there's a third-party landlord issue, and that is a really hard one to unlock, because there's no pressure that can really be brought to the third-party landlord. They move to their own, they've got their own rhythm and their drum beat slightly differently. So if it's a third-party landlord, it's a hard one. If it's a buyer or a seller, then really, if an agent's involved, they should be trying to bring it to a head. And even if bringing it to a head is that really disappointing conclusion that this deal is just not going to happen, at some point you need to walk away. I would always much prefer to have a round the table discussion and get everybody who's a stakeholder in that deal, in a room or on a Zoom, and have a conversation and say, what is going on? What are the roadblocks? What's meaning this doesn't happen? Because if somebody's just lost appetite and doesn't want to do it, then own up and say, actually, I've changed my mind, I'm not interested. Rather than kind of that death by 1,000 cuts where you just day by day, nothing's happening. There might have to be a really honest conversation that says, look, this deal's just not going to happen. But I think if it's been running for a year, for me, there's something fundamentally not right about that. And I think it needs to be dug into to understand what it is.
I think that's worth looking at. And again, I'm going to move a bit different mind into the uncertain future. Two things really. Two questions have come in. I'm going to kind of mix them. One question saying that with the government having to claw money back for COVID funding, my friend Rishi has put in a lot of dollar to fund the country, or a lot of pounds. There's going to be some sort of clawback coming in. This will hit the middle class, such as entrepreneurs relief. Possibly. The NHS has put in a lot of funds. Speculation, we don't know where the new contract's going to go. There's elements of there might be a second wave that might hit patient numbers and valuations. Suddenly, all these things coming in, a seller decides they want a quick sale, maybe to take advantage before this entrepreneur's relief changes, or maybe the valuation's going to change. What sort of thought processes do you convey in these uncertain situations?
We've seen a couple of people who said, look, I want to get a quick sale and I want to get out. They happen in any given year anyway. We get some people that due to a family situation or poor health, they just come to us and say, look, we know you valued it for say £500,000, but honestly, I can't believe values are so high. I'd be happy to go for £350,000. So that happens from time to time. I think the problem and the danger with trying to project into future and uncertainty is it's one of the points you made at the beginning, Drew, is your cup half full or half empty? From a buyer's point of view, I get it. It's risky. There are some unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen. There's that constant fear that you're going to be overpaying for something and there's going to be a crash in the market. At the moment, that hasn't happened. So until it happens, you can only price based on where we are now. Sellers are saying, well, actually, yes, there could be things coming down the line in the future that might affect my value might go down, therefore, is it a good time to get out? I believe we can only work in the here and now. And the here and now is there is confidence. Sure, there is going to be some rebalancing on the NHS side of things, but that's going to affect the profession as a whole. So if it affects the business owners, and they're going to want to maintain their profitability, what they're going to probably do is they're going to probably play with their variable costs. The biggest variable costs in owning a dental practice where you have more than 2 surgeries of associates. So the risk is it's associates that are going to get impacted. It all joins up. It's not an us and them. It's not business owners and people who work in the businesses. We're all connected. In my world, I have a team of people, and I need really good people. I'm going to need good people going forward, regardless. Dental practice are going to need good people, and so we're all joined up one way or the other. And I just think that from an associate point of view, there are vulnerabilities, but actually, because there's so many unknowns, I think it's a personal decision as to whether you think it's the right time to be buying a practice or not.
And I think, again, a couple of last few questions. One is on the lease. So Munis is saying, talk a little bit about the first right of refusal in the leasehold practices and how important it is for buyers to have it added into the lease. So how important that is. And Mehdi is asking, if you're selling the shares in a limited company and the lease is in a limited company name, is the lease transfer easier than individuals?
So on the first point, the Landlord and Tenant Act, the lease will either be in it or without it. It's unlikely if a lease is already in existence. I mean, you can certainly go back to a landlord and ask, but normally it was a conscious and active decision that was made about whether that lease was drawn within the Landlord and Tenant Act. Most leases are, and the only thing you need to be aware of, if it isn't, at the end of the lease term, you do not have an automatic right of renewal. And so in that situation, you just need to be aware that it doesn't mean that the landlord won't renew it. And it may well be that when you do come to renew the lease, if you put in a request for it to be drawn within the Act, they would do it. It's not necessarily, it wasn't done for negative reasons, but if it's not in the lease, it doesn't give you as much protection as it is in the lease. What you wouldn't be able to do is if you saw a dental practice for sale and the lease wasn't within the Act, you couldn't say, well, I'll buy it, but I do want the lease put within the Act, because the reality is the person who's selling the practice operates on a leasehold basis. So going to the freehold, the landlord, and getting that changed is highly unlikely that's going to happen. And that's the sort of thing that takes it from being a 3, 4, 6 month transaction to a 12, 18 month transaction, because landlords just don't engage on those conversations really.
I think, and that's very useful. I hope Mehdi and Munis, that's given you some insight into that area. If I've put the link up again, if anybody wants to book that 30-minute private one-to-one consult with ND on the 9th of September, if that day does get booked out and you can't see any slots, please drop me a message.
The reason that I offered that, Drew, is I'm really conscious that the world in which I operate is quite sensitive. And
yes,
it's okay to have general conversations like we're having now, but I'm also acutely aware people may have very specific questions that they might not want to ask on an open forum with a bunch of other people seeing them ask a question. So the reason for it was, if people got some specific questions, I'm happy to make that time available, and we can work through those questions on a one-to-one basis.
I think it's useful for people, so it's very, very good to have that. Ami was asking, Ami Sutrwala said, do you need a dental accountant and a solicitor to do the due diligence, or just the solicitor?
So you will need an accountant and a solicitor, because ideally as an associate, you've got an accountant who's doing your accounts for you anyway. If you're an associate and you're thinking about buying a practice, it's worth having a relationship with an accountant now anyway. So rather than just filing your own tax return, if you have a relationship with preferably a dental specialist accountant, they're going to be able to structure your accounts in a way so that when you then go and apply for finance, it's going to be easier to demonstrate what your grossing ability is. And also a specialist accountant should be able to make sure that you maximize any tax allowances and relief available, so you're working in the most efficient way possible. When you buy a practice, if you've already got that relationship with the accountant, yes, engage with them, tell them what you're doing, show them the figures. If you don't have to, you can start that relationship when you've acquired a practice. When you buying a practice, you're going to need a solicitor of some sort. The differential cost-wise between a general solicitor and a specialist, in many cases, is nothing. It might be £1,500 more. However, getting somebody that understands the nuances of dentistry, particularly if there's an NHS contract involved, is really important, because people may be aware that an NHS contract has to be migrated from a seller to a buyer in a very particular way to preserve the value and the contract terms. So having a specialist that understands that's really important.
Very, very useful again, because I think anything we do, we try and get as much specialist knowledge, as much valuable knowledge into it, really, which is very useful. There are more and more questions that will come in. If you still have them, please type them below. We are aware that Andy has nicely given his time on a bank holiday weekend. Andy, there's a few people who say the 9th of September is gone. It's fully booked. So
okay, sounds like I've got a busy day coming up.
you do, but there's perhaps a few more people who want to arrange time with you. So
okay, well, what I'll do is let me look at my diary and I'll try and make another day available. It won't be probably until the beginning of October. I'm taking a break towards the end of September, but I'll let you know during. We'll make another date available.
Okay, so anybody who would like to have another date available, please drop me a line or drop your name below, and we will get in touch with you to arrange this, and which will be very useful for everybody as well. I'll let you know as soon as Andy gets a date available. I think this has been an amazing Tubules Live, to be perfectly honest with you, Andy, because there's so much information and so much to think about for everybody to work through this. And I think someone just said, by the way, someone's just asked, Sesh, can you ask Andy if you have to go through solicitors or accountants if you're buying into a practice you work in? I would think, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a danger that because you're friends and you know one another and there's a degree of trust, you certainly don't want to lose that personal goodwill, because that's really powerful, it's really valuable. However, there is an underlying commercial transaction that's going on, and I think to protect both parties, you need a solicitor, and you probably need to check in with your accountant that it's being done properly. That can also help, and whether it's done through your solicitor or whether you engage an agent to act on your behalf on the private sale, sometimes as you go through a transaction, there's going to be some awkward conversations that come up. There's going to be things when you're going to want to negotiate on price, or you're going to ask for something that's a bit awkward. Asking that directly of your principal, if you're the associate buying, you might feel slightly awkward about that. Therefore, if you've got a third party that you can ask that question through, sometimes that just makes it a bit easier, because you don't feel like you're being cheeky or potentially offending somebody. So having that third party in there can be useful. But yes, you absolutely do need a solicitor to act on your behalf to make sure that sale and purchase agreement is legally drafted.
Very, very useful. I hope that question gives you some feedback as well. And I think on that note, Andy, I'm going to say that this has been one of the most interactive Tubules Lives for a while. To have this on a bank holiday Monday, I'd like to thank you and thank the viewers for all of you sparing your time. I hope it's given you some insights, but you know what? I always say the future's bright, the future's orange, the future's positive. So really good to keep that going. I think in the history of mankind, no matter what things have hit us, we've always survived through it. And the big example I always look at, because we're looking at practice or buying, selling property, is John D. Rockefeller. At the time of one of the biggest recessions, this guy was building towers and creating employment. If you're going into practice ownership, you're taking a role of leadership. You're taking a role of giving other people an opportunity with work, you're giving people an opportunity to come and see you, and you're creating a mini environment in a big community. I think that's not just a courageous step to take, it's a very, very awesome step to take for the bigger contribution of humanity. That's the kind of philosophical view I look at business ownership as. I think, Andy, you would probably agree at that. With all the bits you do, it's more than just a business sometimes.
Oh, it's a
It's
passion, and I think it needs to be a passion. I think if you do something you're passionate about, you never work another day.
I think that's absolutely right. So, guys, whatever you do, keep the passion going. That's going to be the key beyond this. There's a few people requesting slots with you, Andy. So I'm going to collect the names and pass them on to you with their email addresses. And you will hopefully be able to arrange another date and be in touch with them.
Yes.
At this place, I will call it a day with this Tubules Live. We've been here for a good couple of hours. I'd like to thank Andy Acton from
Thank you
FTA
very much. It's been really
Associates.
good.
Time. It's been brilliant. I'd like to thank the audience. Every Monday, 7:30. There's nothing else you do. You eat your dinner quickly and get on your computer or telephone, because Tubules Live is here to inspire you. We have lined up everything till I think next February or March. So that's our commitment to you, but we need you listening, because otherwise the speakers would be talking to a blank audience and me. And I'm the most boring audience sometimes. You are the interactive audience. This has been Tubules Live, inspiring you on a bank holiday Monday evening with Andy Acton from FTA. Thank you for your time, guys. Have a great evening. Thanks.